Okay, let me welcome all of you to ODI. I'm Kevin Watkins. I'm director here, and I'm actually really. We have lots of meetings in ODI, but I'm really thrilled to be hosting this meeting. I'm going to hand over to Ruth Levine in a moment, who's the director of the Global Development and Population Programme at the ULIT Foundation. Many of you will know Ruth's work both in health and in education. Ruth actually wrote one of those incredible books. I think it was a game changer in health, actually. It was such a game changer, Millions Saved, which was an account really of the extraordinary progress that had been made in many dimensions of health, and I think also did some path-breaking work on the development of markets for vaccines in the health sector. And has more recently been leading ULIT's work on education. And I think this is really an example of philanthropic venture capital, if you like, playing a transformative role in the way that we understand education problems and look at opportunities in education. Two of the people that Ruth has worked very closely with are here. Rukmini Banerjee, who many of you will know, who's now director of Pratham, and ASA, and Sarah Ruto, who has taken up the ASA framework, if you like, and applied it in East Africa. And I think actually the framework is something that is both brilliant and simple at the same time, and actually its brilliance is its simplicity. And that many of us who have worked in education, we get bogged down in these very cumbersome ways of understanding education quality, and have sort of paralysed ourselves over the years, I think. But I think what you've done through ASA is that you've taken what appears to be a very simple framework that goes right to the heart of the learning crisis. That are you in grade 4, and can you, having gone through 4 years of schooling, meet the standard that would be expected of a grade 2 child? And it's a sort of intuitively obvious way of doing it, and because it's so intuitively obvious, of course, nobody had done it before. So you did that, and I think you just, having been in India a couple of times when you've launched, and also in Kenya actually when the ASA reports in Kenya have been launched, the traction they've had with the media is absolutely extraordinary, and I think it sort of indicates the way that it started to shift debate. So thank you for being here. It's a real privilege to host you. I'm going to actually hand over to Ruth now to introduce all of you properly, and Joe as well. So thank you very much.
Great. Wow, thank you so much, Kevin. It's really great to be here, and we more or less invited ourselves to do a public event here, so we're really extremely grateful that you were willing to open your house to us while we're in London all together. So I have a few tasks as moderator. So the first is to make a few official statements, as in this event is on the record, so if you ask a question, make sure it's one you want the world to hear. And that goes for you ladies as well. If the fire alarm sounds, grab a glass of wine and leave the building by the reception. Please turn off your mobile phones and perhaps even put them away. There are publications, ODI publications, that are on subject matter related to the topic of this outside. And we really invite you to stay to the end of the event when we'll be able to talk informally over refreshments. So we thought actually to begin, instead of the more formal introductions, we should just plunge right in and take you to the settings in which these citizen-led assessments are done and watch a short film. So this is about 6 minutes long and hopefully will give you a sense of the work. We ready to go with the film?
When I look at development today, there are 3 massive challenges that everybody is talking about. And the first is jobs. The second is what are prospects for young people who seem to be really quite dissatisfied across the world. and the third is inequality. And really, when people say, well, how are we going to address all of these three things? The answer turns out to be the same. It's education.
Many of our children are going to school. And this has been the story for the last 50 years we have had independence. They go to school because there's a belief that parents have, a belief that families have, that going to school gives them the skills and competencies that they need.
You know, the thinking was that, okay, if we build enough schools, if we have enough teachers, if we have enough teaching learning material in classrooms, then this fuzzy thing called learning will kind of happen.
We began to really feel this invisible problem, which was the fact that children are in school, attending fairly regularly, but really not at the level that they need to be. So I would say that we have a learning crisis.
But it was very hard to make that case and get policymakers to pay attention because we didn't have data, we didn't have evidence.
They invented this tool of household-based, very lightweight evaluations. You don't take a lot of people's time, you don't take a lot of organizations. You can do it in remote districts using volunteers.
How does the assessment work? What we do is we pick a district. India has more than 600 districts. So we go to every district in the country. We identify, and sometimes people identify us, a local organization or an institution or a college or an NGO. And what they do is they go to a sample of villages in the district. And in the villages, you sample kids. There's a process that we use.
I am 6 years old. My school is
When you go into a
Primary
household,
School.
you're testing all kids. You're not just testing the kids who happen to be in school on that particular day. That's a big advantage because in many of the contexts that we're talking about in developing countries, not all kids go to school.
There's a lot of really sophisticated technical work on how to properly assess learning. And you have many different methods depending on the different type of assessment. And some, like national exams, assess every kid, right, who gets to a certain level. Others, such as international tests that compare results of different countries, just takes a sample, a randomized sample to make sure it's representative. The thing not many people necessarily know about the citizen-led assessment piece is what a broad scale it's done under.
By being able to go to every single district of the country, and in every single district going to 30 enumeration areas or 30 villages, what it allows you to do is to, in a sense, engage the whole country.
Citizen-led assessments play an important part in that accountability in the sense that they are a little bit separate from the system. They are an independent voice that marshals citizens to actually collect the information to then reflect on the citizens themselves.
Now, if you're the Minister for Education, if you're the Minister for Finance, making decisions around how do I allocate my money, how do I ensure accountability, this data is incredibly useful because it allows you to zero in and focus on where there are problems.
It's all becoming more and more valuable over time as we get more countries, we get more benchmarks, we get more years. So I think that this is something which is building, and it's certainly helped move the needle to say that we can actually get measures and statistics on learning outcomes.
The post-2015 education framework must have learning in it, because I think it is no longer sufficient just to go to school.
The focus will be much more on learning, and which in turn will generate a demand for learning metrics, and that will hopefully also boost and give encouragement to these citizen assessments that will then spread even further so that we'll get a dynamic of really building this movement across the world.
And today, I think the different efforts in the different countries together reach more than 1 million children a year. And it's really amazing how simple things can go really far.
So as we move into the future, let us focus on the access of the children and their learning, easily measure the learning outcomes on a continuous basis, to know that the system is functioning, either to act themselves, but also to hold those who are responsible accountable, the schools, the government, If they don't have the information and understanding of how the system is functioning, they won't be able to demand what they deserve. And what they deserve is quality education of their children.
If they can't read, they can't count, how are we going to talk about analytical skills, critical thinking, all those other life skills they're supposed to acquire?
Helping to shift the focus on learning outcomes, helping to shift the focus on how we spend our resources by sharpening the debate on the types of policies and programs we need, that we will in fact have better learning, and in doing so, fulfill that promise for millions of poor people, that education in fact is liberation, that education in fact will help you have a much better life.
Thanks very much for that. So now we'll turn to the live and in person, and for those who are watching online, kind of somewhat remote conversation, and those who are watching online, please feel free to use the chat room to voice your questions. So let me now do a little bit more formal introduction of the panelists. Rukmini Banerjee is director of the Asser Center, as Kevin said, which is an autonomous research and assessment unit of Pratham, which is a non-governmental education-focused organization working across 20 states in India. Rukmini was originally trained as an economist, but has broken free of those shackles, I believe, and was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, so knows this country relatively well. In the early 80s, she completed her PhD at the University of Chicago in 1991. And she did her postdoctoral work at the Population Research Center at the University of Chicago, I believe, with a Hewlett Fellowship, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right? With Pratham, Rukmini's work has primarily focused on this assessment that we've been talking about, and she's pioneered its spread throughout India and has been really central in the transfer of knowledge internationally. And later this year, Rukmini will become the CEO of Pratham. Dr. Sarah Ruto serves as coordinator of the newly established People's Action for Learning Network, which I'm sure she'll talk about in a moment. It comprises civil society organizations now in 9 countries, is that right? 9 countries that are engaged in conducting citizen-led assessments. Prior to that, she was the lead for Uwezo, which conducts the assessments in Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya. And before joining Uwezo, she was a lecturer at Kenyatta University, and she has her doctoral degree from Heidelberg University in Germany. And I'm delighted also that we are joined by Joe Wales. And I was particularly happy that we have a man on the panel because I never sit on all female panels, and I would have had to refuse if asked to moderate. So Joe joined the politics and governance team at ODI in August 2012, and with colleagues studies the politics of service delivery around the world. Before joining ODI, he worked in Mexico and India for small non-governmental organizations and has been involved in randomized controlled trial evaluations in the past. So we'll look forward to that, his contributions to the conversation. So I'm just going to pose a couple of questions over the next few minutes to Rukmini and Sarah, and we can hear from them. Joe's going to make a few comments, and then we'll have plenty of time to hear your comments and questions, so please note them. And that also goes for you folks on online. So Rukmini, let me start with you, okay? Since you sort of started it all. You've been doing the assessments at Asser for 10 years now. Over that time, can you talk a little bit about the kinds of impact you've seen at different levels and also maybe the kinds of impacts you hope to see and haven't quite materialized yet?
Firstly, I didn't start anything. I've just been part of this whole
big thing. I don't know how it got so big either. So 10 years is quite a long time, and we are quite a big country, so that leaves a big stage for doing many things and for many things to happen. I think 10, 12 years ago, in policy or in planning kinds of documents in India, you would not see the words learning, outcomes, measurement of learning, reading. These kinds of words, I think, were relatively rare. There may have been references to quality of education, but I always think quality of education is a bit like Hinduism. It means, we all worship at our own gods. And, we're all very religious, but we're not really united about our gods, kind of thing. 10 years down the road, I think if you look at our policy documents now, these words are much more frequent, hopefully more central. We did have a new right to education law that was put into action in the year 2010. That doesn't have any of these. So I think we look at that law as kind of referring to the last 110 years. But if you want to look ahead, I think you have to think about these words. But a lot of our planning documents, our economic policy documents seem to have these words in it. So I think that is one big impact, that it's not just enough to think about schooling. You now need to think about schooling and learning, and they are connected, but they are also distinct. And clear efforts need to be made in both. The second one, I think, is that this basic foundations of what this whole education business is all about, basic reading, basic arithmetic, has also come quite to the center. And I won't say that there is wide-scale acceptance, but I think that more and more that these fundamental blocks need to come into place, and if they haven't come into place in the first couple of years, then you need to run, remedial programs to make that happen. I think that is also gaining. And the third thing is, I think that that there is a learning crisis is perhaps much more accepted today. It was not even thought of 10 years ago. There's much more measurement around these issues going on. Now, sometimes the measurements don't necessarily lead to the kinds of solutions you want. But if you look at this all as a big body of work, I would say that it's all kind of in its own way heading towards making learning a central piece of the whole education business. And then we hope that along with evidence, along with acceptance, will come more robust solutions of what is to be done.
Can you just say a little bit about how important, if it has been, that this has been an effort that's independent of the government?
Yeah, I think that the independence and the scale. So it's not just that it was an independent effort. For a country like India, we think that, doing it in a few places probably would not have had the same traction. So one is that it was independent. So you could move nimbly, quickly. You could actually take on some things that, looking back now, seem very brave to have done. When you were actually doing it, we didn't perhaps think that hard. It just seems common sense that kids should learn the first things first and then build the whole structures on it. Doing it in 500 to 575 to 580 districts every year, doing it like clockwork, having these estimates which are available at district level. I think all of these have contributed to whatever impact we've had. Because the first couple of years, people would think, it's just a one-time thing, and it's just a study. And we have great respect for studies, but you take the studies, you put them away. They usually come with nice, colorful covers, and then you refer to them from time to time. And then, we treat our religious books the same way. I don't know why I'm not anti-religious or anything, but we don't really read them. We worship them and we put them away, and we do the same thing to our reports and our studies. So I think bringing these things out, the independence was important because then you can disseminate widely. You can use them in ways that are, very simple to understand. I think all of these in some way has contributed to, making it a piece of the education landscape for India.
Yeah, thanks. So Sarah, do you want to sort of tell how this idea migrated across the ocean to Africa?
Yeah, in a very unplanned way. We were all doing our own things, and then Rakesh was then heading an organization in Tanzania, called a number of us from East Africa and said, there's something interesting. I always remember when he was talking to us, he told us, there's something interesting happening in India. Would you like to go and see? And I like traveling, so I thought, well, why not? I didn't realize that actually that would be how I'd start leaving my job in the university. Because we went, and we never had any thoughts, any assumptions. It was to go and see this something interesting that is being done. And basically, once we had gone to the field, it captivated us. And so when I look back, well, what are the things that, how did we move, in terms of from interest to actually happening? So first, there was just that curiosity. And most of us were in the initial team, had been doing research in education. We thought those things are not going on well, and you want to do. So there was that curiosity, that interest within, that perhaps something can happen. And when we went, we never went alone. It was a group. And I think that is often the problem with some of the other things that start. Something is presented ready-made to the ministries of education. But in this particular case, we were all at the same level. So the team that we went were about 9 people, 10 people from the 3 countries, were made up of people from the university, from the ministry. And so we went through the processing of, is this a good thing? Can it work? Can it not work? Nobody imposed the other. We were all at an equal level, beginning on this dialogue. And that, I think, was a very important ingredient at that particular time. A dialogue that came from us, not anybody else imposing it on us. And then, of course, if India had not opened the door to us, Rukmini is normally called the matriarch of citizen-led assessments. I don't think she likes that term, but
No,
that's what it is. Yeah, so, but if the door had, the reception had not been warm, then probably, we wouldn't have continued. So we got to India and met people who had a very different notion of doing things. That was the first time we even, would share their tools openly, even their data. Data where I came from at that particular time was protected. You've done it, you're the one to write your paper. But it was a very different environment. And that support, I think, also made us realize this is something you want to be part of. So that sharing was very important, because we took those tools and the various insights as they were. Some we changed, some we didn't, because we didn't need to change them. And when we came back to our context, we also then went through the process of just internalizing it and adapting it, testing it, piloting it. We even piloted some things that probably we shouldn't have because the contexts are different. Rukmini was reminding me about the 5th household rule that they use in India for sampling. They go to every 5th household. And we tried it in Kenya, and yet we don't even live in the same small clusters. We have people who live in farms. So that first pilot, very many people walked and walked. And it was in the arid area. And in this area, some people went to particular villages, and then it's near the park. And one group, the elephants came to that particular boma where they were, and my friend always remembers how she had to cling onto a tree. She thought she had climbed it, but later on, when the scare was gone, she realized her feet were still firmly on the ground. So, but that's the part of this citizen-led assessment. It always has this. So piloting it was also very important, making it your own. And that process has to be lived by you. Nobody else can do it. And then the final thing is that we also, when we went to India, we did not change the ideals, the principles. We remained committed to them. The fact that citizens have to be involved so that they themselves are part of the process, that we are not extractive. We come in from an area where there's a lot of extractive minerals industries. But here you identify people who are part of those districts and villages to be part of the research process, and then the knowledge remains with them, because then perhaps they can do something. It's not that people, parachuting yourselves from the Nairobi or the various cities, Kampala, and taking back, as has always been. So these things were slight changes, but they meant a lot.
So that was kind of the process that we went through, from us, and of course with support from the Hewlett Foundation initially, and then later on a number of people came in East Africa to support us. And what started as interest, I think, as she was talking about the impacts they've had, we also almost see the same thing that has happened in the region, where at least today we see many people are aware there is a problem and that you need to focus on learning.
Yeah, great. And so that is largely the story about Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda for over the past, is it 5 years?
Yes.
5 years or so. And then somewhat more recently, well, before that, Pakistan learned and adapted and has been doing almost annual. And then more recently, Senegal and Mali have started to do work, is that right?
Yes. Senegal, Rukmini and her people hosted very many waves of people from Africa, because the East Africa wave was the first one. Then in 2010, the delegation from Mali first went to India, because, it's like a pilgrimage, you must start there. But later on also in East Africa, we hosted them so that they can understand the processes. And then Senegal, so Mali and Senegal, those are the two countries. And then Mexico. And very recently, Nigeria is about to start. So these are the countries, the 9 countries that are now the PAL network, because at the end of last year, from this year, I moved on to heading this small secretariat known as the PAL network. And the reason we created the PAL network, which has been there before, we called ourselves initially a family, and we called ourselves the Juba family, and these were just initials of the initial countries, Jagando, Uwezo, Bekungo, which is Mali, and then Asa, But we later on realized that, it's not, it doesn't really comprise us, because we were growing, and anyway, it's the name of South Sudan, capital city. You don't want to compete. So very recently we decided that we want to be known as the PAL network. As you can see, even the definitions are different, but PAL is People's Action for Learning. I think something else has been written here. But it doesn't matter. PAL, like a friend, this is what the citizen-led assessment is all about, building friendships, because when friends discuss, probably you can do something more. And the PAL network will do a number of things. But one of them is that there are many countries, whenever we have talked, that are interested. But that interest has never built on. So perhaps we could be more like friends and lend a hand in a better way, constructive way. The same way we received a lot of help from India and other countries received maybe from Uwezo, is the same way we want to extend this to whoever is interested. That interest has to come from within. And so this secretariat will seek to support the onboarding in a structured way. There's a wealth of information within, and sometimes without, that can be given to these particular countries. And then because, as you can see, we are different names. And unless somebody talks to you, you will not know that Asa and Bekungo, that there is a similarity. The names actually all have a similar meaning. We're either talking about learning, capability, impact, whatever it is, but you wouldn't know. So we want at least to ensure that people know that this is an umbrella that is actually united very closely in its design, in key principles that, we will do our work in the households. It's the one-to-one, focusing on the basics, and, amplify this voice, because this approach has something to offer. It has something to offer, especially as we grapple with concerns that probably are bigger in the developing world, where Nigeria, the new entrant, has got 10 million. They were complaining the other day that how come that number never goes up or down, even when they have problems. So it's maybe plus or minus several millions. Pakistan as well has got so many out-of-school children. So if you go to the school, how will you reach these children? And yet countries have made commitments to all the children. So there is something that in this approach that I think should be taken seriously. I think it has been taken seriously, maybe that's why you're seated here, but there is a lot more that can be done.
Thanks very much. I'm going to, Joe, turn to you for a few reflections from a different perch.
Thank you. I mean, to start with, I'd just like to thank both of our speakers for coming along while they've been in the UK. I'm both shocked and delighted to be on a panel with such a prestigious company and representatives of organisations which really are, I mean, pioneers in what is a very, very important area and doing some really very interesting work. Several years ago now, I was working in South India, and I was lucky to be in sort of rural Bangalore while they were doing some of the asset surveying there. And I was really struck at the time by kind of the beauty of the simplicity of it, that, you know, you could get a community together, really put education front and center for a day, and really add something to people's lives in terms of sort of their understanding of how their children were learning. And it was, you know, really quite a moving and a very, very powerful tool. What I'm going to talk about now is sort of reflect a bit from some of the work which we're doing here at ODI around the politics of service delivery, a lot of which has been crystallized in our recent Adapting and Development report, and think a bit about sort of how citizen assessments might fit into this, and, you know, then ask our two speakers a few more questions to sort of, you know, dig a little bit deeper. I mean, this work really emerges from kind of a very similar narrative from what we've heard before, that there's a recognition that while we've made great steps in terms of getting access students into school, particularly at primary level, there's still a major challenge in getting to zero, to making sure that no children are out of school, and also a huge challenge in terms of learning outcomes over the world, that there is very much a learning crisis. And a lot of our research has pointed to the fact that a lot of the kind of the commonly rolled out solutions to this, the need for more financing, or for sort of implementing particular silver bullet strategies, just hasn't really functioned in practice. The link between actual education spending and channeling money into systems and the results you get out of it has been very, very weak. And there's been, I mean, large numbers of sort of well-meaning RCTs and attempts to sort of transfer, you know, education programs which seem to have worked in particular contexts into others without making much allowances for context, which has, you know, really not achieved much in terms of the results. And the conclusion which we've come to, and sort of which we've begun to generate more and more examples of, is that we need to take much more of a problem-solving approach, not assuming that there are large boilerplate solutions to things, but instead recognizing that systems work in particular ways because of the political incentives that people have at different levels, and that we really need to engage with this, to be willing to kind of modify programs to suit the, you know, the conditions which they're in, and to build kind of coalitions across civil society and government to try and get the results which we're all after. And particularly talking to both of you earlier today, it really is quite striking that it seems that, you know, in many ways Pratham and the PAL network do seem to be embodying many, many of these ideas, that you've come from a problem around service, you know, the delivery of education services that children aren't learning, and rather than assuming that there's a particular set of solutions, you've begun to, you know, identify the problem, to work out, you know, who it is within government that you can work with, and where sort of the linchpins are. And it's interesting as well with the PAL network, this is very much, you know, not an assumption that what's worked in India is going to automatically work in Tanzania or Kenya, but, you know, taking the basic principles, tinkering, seeing what's working, and then, you know, adapting those ways of working to those new contexts. And so my interest really, I suppose, and the kind of the questions I want to ask is more about the information itself is very, very powerful. We've, you know, put education quality has now been put on the table in a way which it wasn't being talked about before, and we now have, you know, a much, much better idea because of this work of the state of learning in a lot of countries. But the kind of the crucial question is sort of what comes next? What can you use with the data? How do you actually use that then to get results? I mean, this is one of those things which is quite challenging. If you're a parent, even if you didn't know that your child wasn't learning before, now that you do know there's a major problem, it's not always immediately clear what exactly you can do with that information. It's very hard to go and challenge teachers when they're in a position of authority, and particularly in systems where they seem to have more or less impunity in terms of whether or not they turn up for work. Even if you can engage with them, if you're on side, there's only so much which, you know, you can solve on a local level. Many of these problems are very, very systemic. And so it'd be interesting to hear from both of you sort of examples of, you know, how your organizations have, you know, engaged with citizens, what citizens have done with the information, and how you sort of mobilize them in that sense. And kind of at the opposite end, I mean, in certain circumstances, just, you know, having the information that children aren't learning is enough to galvanize particular policymakers and to get solutions. But in others, it's often very difficult to translate, a change in policy at the very top into the practice on the ground. Particularly, and the incentives for doing that are quite tricky if there are powerful teachers' unions who you can't necessarily take on, or if there are a whole range of different structures around patronage, which is difficult for you maybe as an MP or as an education administrator in a particular area to begin to challenge. And so to understand a bit more about how you've gone about sort of seeking out allies in government and the strategies which you've used and how it works differently in different places would be very, very interesting as well. And so, yeah, I'll probably leave it there.
One of the things that I think has worked for us is that the release of the report every year enables a whole new opportunity for conversations. And I remember from one of the early years, 2006 I think it was, that you took the report and then it was sort of your passport to talk to anybody. I remember I went to one of the big states in India, Uttar Pradesh, and basically knocked on people's doors and said, there is this report. They'd heard about it in the press, so they were curious as well as to how it was done. And I had a discussion with the head of the primary education system. And the interesting thing was that he said to me, I'm looking at these results, your enrollment numbers match ours. So there's schooling and then there is learning. The enrollment numbers match ours, so the attendance numbers match ours. Learning, we don't have numbers. So just by projection, probably what you're saying is correct. And then he went down the list and he said, I don't have a problem with my state's results because I know we are not in very good shape. But I have a real problem with the Tamil Nadu results. Because Tamil Nadu is a state in which service delivery is very good. All the mothers are probably educated, or, we in North India think everything must be fine in the South. And so he picked up the phone in front of me and he called the Tamil Nadu counterpart. And I'm sitting right there wondering what should be my... So I just thought it would be rude to leave at this moment. It would seem cowardly, so I should just keep sitting around. And so he picks up the phone and he calls the guy and he says, have you seen the ASER report? And I can only hear one side. Presumably the guy said yes. So he said, so do you agree? Because what we in Uttar Pradesh, as one of the most educationally backward states in India are doing, is we are following what we think is your path. You build schools, you build preschool centers, you gave hot midday meal, you gave textbooks. We're all trying to do that. And now along comes ASER and says, oh, by the way, Tamil Nadu results are not good. So where does this leave us? What model are we supposed to use? So please tell me that either they are wrong, in which case that I can just proceed with doing what I was doing. But if they are right, then where does this leave us? I couldn't hear, what was going on the other side. But there was actually discussions of this type. And this was one example where it happened in front of me. There may have been others that didn't. So number one, it gave us an opportunity to talk. It gave us an opportunity to talk on topics that had not been talked before. And in that UP case, when he put the phone down, he said, so then what am I supposed to do? And I said, well, you should try some of the solutions we have. And he said, okay, tell me what your solutions are. And the solution was that if you look at 5th grade, I don't have the report right here, but if you look at the 5th grade results, the numbers roughly say 50% of the kids in 5th grade are able to read 2nd grade text, which means 50% also cannot. But if you look at the cannot, the tail of the distribution is really long. And it's a very common sense thing, is that in that tail, there is a whole variety of kids. The 5th grade textbook will probably only be okay for the 10% of the class. So we need to do something else with all of these others. And from this conversation came a plan to actually try something out in the schools. Now, this is one example of where they agreed. Tamil Nadu, who has been very worried about their results, because their results are among the worst, and they have had very good service delivery, their expenditures and other things are good, unleashed their own assessment to see whether this was correct or not. So there were all kinds of different reactions to this input that came into the system. Some people just thought, like the monsoon cloud, just, it'll go away and we can go back to business and use you. Others engaged on it. My own home state, Bihar, for example, agreed that this is really important, but they still had millions of children out of school. So they said, why don't you work with us on getting those kids in first? And whatever we can do in that process, let's try to do. So there were, I think what it did was it, as I said, it created a lot of opportunity for all kinds of things. And it, to us as Pratham, how much we leveraged out of that. And one of the things that we've seen is that the lower down in the structure that you are, the more easy it is for you to accept reality, because your reality is in the face. I mean, you know, you're a teacher in a classroom. I mean, you're dealing with that reality of the tail of the distribution on a daily basis. So if somebody comes along with a solution, you actually quite like it. We haven't had any trouble from teachers' unions, partly because they're busy with other things. You know, they're not, you know, at least in India, they're not worried about children's learning. They're worried about their own working conditions. But when you actually engage with them, they think, you know, a recent meeting that we had with teachers' unions in Bihar, they said, you know, of all our 38 districts, 35 of them are still worried about working conditions. But there are 4 which want to do something on learning. How about you go talk to them and see how far it can go? So, you know, it's just talking at every level, offering some, as Pratham we had some solutions. We've never said it's the only solution, but offering to work with you on those. I think all of these have led to a lot of different alignments within the government. The tool has gotten a lot further than the data. And that could be, again, something that, you know, the tool is quite useful inside the classroom, in the village, you know, with your grandmother, I mean, whatever you want to do with it. The data that comes out that you have generated, you are more willing to often accept. So we have used the tool in different ways. We use the data in different ways. But I would say overall, we use it as a way to start a conversation and push it to see how far it will go. And, you know, if it doesn't go that far this year, it doesn't mean it won't go far next year. So this repeated doing, you know, 10 years of doing this, we've learned that in 10 years, many things can change. And so you should just keep doing what you're doing. And even our enemies said, don't stop. I mean, you know, we need something to, you know, shout about every year. So there is, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you know, in a sense, the 10-year period has also been important in being able to see how far you can take it.
Sarah, do you have any comments about sort of how this relates to the challenge or the opportunities of really deep systemic change, at least in the context that you've been working in?
And just to pick up from Rukmini's comment, had this, the work in East Africa, you know, been done like any other, you know, every 2 years you do an assessment, then you stop, or like SACMEC does it, you know, so many years interval and takes again many more years to release it, I don't think we would have seen any traction that we have seen now. So there is something to learn about persistence, but also simplicity and repeating the same message. We really thought about what we wanted the report to look like. And the title of the report for the last 5 years, the main report that is given out, is simply, Are Our Children Learning? And it is a question that seeks a response. And I figured that my job was almost done when I would meet people in the last year and they would start the conversation. You know, our children are not learning, and, you know, go on. And that for me was a pointer that at least there is acceptance that there is something that needs to be done. East Africa is a smaller country than, you know, the vastness of India. And so there has been quite a bit of policy changes that are visible, statements that have been written and documents that you can get that today, you know, state that we must focus on the foundational skills. That is there in Kenya and in Tanzania. Tanzania, which has made, you know, major changes, that the first 2 years are just focusing on the basics. This is something that would never have happened, I think, without this evidence showing the scale of the problem that we have. And other than this, you also have the civil society. There are very many NGOs who are actors. And at least by the time I left last year, we had about 10, 15 NGOs who had taken our tool and were using it in their own programs. So we have the big actions, you know, like from the government, and then there are the other smaller actions like from NGOs, and then there are the much smaller ones from individuals and institutions that we don't even know. So when one is looking at change, I think it's easier to talk about the big one because you can get documentation easier, but it will be very interesting, to find out how much this persistent conversation in languages that people understand can take you far. Because when the data is released, and as Kevin said, it's a very active discussion, but in also very many media and languages. Radio is very important, and for the younger children, SMS. Whatever, because many people also receive texts, a particular age group, but the older generation are more oral. Want to discuss things, so you use whatever will reach people to generate discussions. We had radio discussions because we were losing out teachers because they felt that the results were bashing them. And so one of the most popular things on radio has been the head teachers competition, in which, because we are citizen-led, would ask citizens to nominate a head teacher of a public primary school whom they feel is doing good work. And then they would nominate, and they would go through a discussion, and then, we give them a certificate that they were nominated by citizens as teachers. It had nothing other than the fact that, and it's a certificate that is really valued by the people who win. So there are different ways in which one can begin conversations and make people feel valued, and who can then they were doing their work anyway, but they continue doing it in a different way. But maybe if I just comment now from the PAL network, different countries are using the data or dealing with the what next conversation in a different way. We have also India and Pakistan and a little bit Senegal, who are involved in the what next question. Doing either, like Prathamosh or Rukmini has talked about, they have various programs that another wing is doing, but in which you're actively involved. Or Senegal, where they have decided to put their intellectual input in coming up with something to follow up on the data. And then you have others like the Uwezos, the 3 Uwezo countries, and Mali, which sort of invest a lot of energy on the assessment and giving the data. And then you have people who are interested who come with a question, but now what do we need to do? And you direct them to others, people. And luckily, like in Kenya, you now have, other programs that have come up who are dealing with this. But I think that is something that one needs to think about. How can you take advantage of this momentum that the process of collecting data generates? Because when I look back, there were so many lost opportunities. There are so many partners who started off with us in Uwezo in a very high note because they felt this is the one thing that will take them to the action part, but we stopped at the thermometer level for various reasons. So, but how does one keep that momentum? Because that energy is needed, and it cannot just rest in the ministries of education. How do you capitalize on it for the what next?
Great, thank you so much. So let me invite questions. I'll take a few questions that you might have.